She pretended to be blind. Until the truth shattered her Mafia Boss husband 8 months ago, everything changed for Sienna Vance. A car bombing left her blind and confined to a wheelchair. At least that's what her husband believes. But in a mansion built on blood money and buried secrets, the woman who cannot see sees everything. 8 months earlier, Sienna Vance was untouchable. Not in the way her husband was untouchable. Not through fear, not through violence, not through the quiet threat of a name that made men lower their eyes in restaurants. Sienna's power was older than that. She came from legacy. 3 generations of Hargrove old money, art foundations, offshore trusts, political friendships that predated the current administration by 2 decades. She had a law degree she'd never practiced because she'd never needed to. Oh, she had a mind that catalogued everything: tone, timing, the precise weight of a pause in conversation. She had married Malachi Vance at 31, and everyone in their world had called it a merger. They weren't wrong. Malachi was 28 when she met him, younger, rawer, magnetic in the way that dangerous things always are. His neck and arms were covered in ink that told stories he never explained, and his eyes held the particular stillness of a man who had learned very early that stillness kept him alive. He ran the Vance syndicate with surgical efficiency, import logistics on paper, territorial enforcement in practice. He was brilliant. He was ruthless. And for 3 years, Sienna had believed he loved her. She had been wrong about very few things in her life. That was the one she would not forgive. Before we go further, let's take a quick second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy powerful story dramas like this. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The first sign was not the late nights. Men in Malachi's position kept irregular hours by necessity. She had understood that before she signed the marriage license. It wasn't the phone calls that stopped when she entered a room, or the new security detail that she didn't recognize and hadn't approved. It was the way he started looking through her. Not at her, through her. As though she had become glass, present, decorative, and utterly transparent. She noticed. She said nothing. She began to watch. The night of the explosion, Sienna had been scheduled to attend a charity dinner alone. Malachi had sent his apologies. "Business, my love. Do you understand?" And she had kissed his cheek and told him she did. She left the house at 7:14 p.m. By 7:31, she had turned the car around. She'd forgotten the auction paddle, a small thing, meaningless. But as her driver pulled back through the estate gates, the headlights swept across the side courtyard, and Sienna saw her husband crouched beside her personal vehicle, the one she took when she drove herself, the one he knew she preferred. He didn't see her. She told the driver to keep moving, to circle the block, to say nothing. At 9:52 p.m., that car detonated in the parking structure beneath the Meridian Hotel. Sienna was still in the second vehicle, shaking, silent, already thinking. She spent 4 days in the hospital. The official report said traumatic impact, ocular nerve damage, spinal contusion. At the attending physicians, her physicians, people her family had retained for years, understood what she needed without being told explicitly. A woman like Sienna Vance did not make requests. She made arrangements. She would be blind. Permanently. Officially. She would require a wheelchair, a cane. Round-the-clock observation. She would return to the Vance estate as a broken woman, a tragedy, a queen reduced to furniture. And from that wheelchair, she would watch her husband destroy himself. Malachi received the news at the hospital in the manner Sienna expected. Hands braced on the doorframe, jaw tight, eyes wet with something that could be mistaken for grief. He held her hand. He spoke to the doctors in a low, controlled voice. He told her she would want for nothing, that he would care for her, that this changes nothing between them. But Sienna lay still with her eyes closed behind the bandages. She listened to his breathing. She heard what was underneath the grief, relief. He brought her home on a Tuesday. The foyer of the Vance estate was everything it always had been. White marble, a chandelier that cost more than most people's homes, the grand staircase curving upward like the spine of something ancient and proud. Sienna had always loved that foyer. It felt to her like the entrance to a place that mattered. She was wheeled through it in dark silk and black sunglasses, her white cane across her lap, her expression composed into the careful blankness of a woman whose world had gone dark. Malachi walked beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder with the particular tenderness of a man performing tenderness for an audience. "You're home," he said. Yes," Sienna replied softly. "I'm home." That night, after he settled her by the window and told her he had calls to make, she listened to his footsteps ascend the staircase. Then she reached beneath the armrest of her wheelchair and pressed a small, recessed button, no larger than a shirt button, installed by a woman who owed Sienna a debt that predated her marriage. 41 cameras came online across the estate, every room, every hallway, every private corner. Sienna sat by the window in the dark and smiled for the first time in 4 days. The first week, Malachi maintained the performance admirably, attentive, present. He brought her meals, guided her hand to her water glass, read her the news in the evenings in that low, even voice of his. He was, by every observable measure, a devoted husband processing a devastating loss. By the second week, a woman arrived at the estate. "Her name is Katerina," Malachi told her. "She'll help with your care, company for you during the days." That same evening, Sienna's earpiece, a device no larger than a hearing aid, tuned to the estate's internal audio feed, picked up the sound of kissing in the east hallway. By the third week, Katerina had stopped pretending to be staff. She walked through the foyer in a red dress while Sienna sat in her chair with her cane and her dark glasses and her perfect, unreadable stillness. Walked past her like she was a portrait on the wall, a piece of furniture, a relic from a previous chapter that hadn't yet been cleared away. Malachi didn't stop her. He didn't even look at his wife. Sienna's hands rested in her lap, very still, very calm, behind the dark lenses. Her eyes tracked Katerina across the marble floor with the quiet, absolute attention of a woman counting down. 8 months, 41 cameras, thousands of hours of footage, every whisper, every transaction, every kill order signed across the dining room table she had chosen herself when they'd first moved in. Every kiss Katerina received in rooms that had been Sienna's. Every meeting Malachi held with men who served a rival organization. Men who were, Sienna eventually understood, receiving something far more valuable than territory. He was selling information, commission intelligence, the names and locations of people who trusted him with their lives. He wasn't just betraying his wife, he was betraying everyone. Sienna had set out to save herself. She was going to take down the entire empire in the process. Yes, tonight is Malachi's 35th birthday gala. The marble foyer gleams, the chandelier blazes. 500 guests have gathered to celebrate a man they believe is untouchable. Sienna sits in her wheelchair at the edge of the room, exactly where Malachi placed her. A prop, a symbol, a sad and silent testament to his loyalty to a woman life had broken. Her white cane rests against her knee. Her dark glasses catch the light, and in her earpiece, her lawyer's voice confirms what she already knows. Everything is in position. The screens are loaded. The FBI is outside. Say the word. Malachi raises his glass at the podium and begins to speak. Sienna tilts her head slightly, the way she has learned to do, the practiced gesture of a woman orienting herself by sound alone. Then she reaches up and removes her glasses. The charity dinner had been Sienna's idea. She had organized it the way she organized everything, quietly, precisely, with the particular efficiency of a woman who understood that power expressed loudly was power half spent. The Hargrove Foundation's annual auction benefiting children's literacy programs, 300 guests, a ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, her name on the program as founding patron, Malachi's name beside hers, because that was the arrangement, because his money needed her name the way contaminated water needs a clean glass to be served in. She had dressed carefully that evening, dark silk, her mother's pearls, hair swept back from her face the way Malachi had once told her he preferred it, a habit she hadn't yet broken, the small, unconscious performances of a marriage she still believed in. She had kissed his cheek in the foyer beneath the chandelier and told him she'd be home by 11. He had smiled and told her she was beautiful. She had believed him. At 7:14 p.m., her driver pulled through the estate gates heading south toward the city. At 7:26, Sienna realized the auction paddle, a slim ivory thing, monogrammed, more symbol than necessity, was sitting on her dressing table upstairs. She almost let it go. It was a small thing. She could borrow one at the door. But it had been her mother's, and Sienna Hargrove Vance did not leave her mother's things behind. She asked the driver to turn back. He did so without comment. They re-entered the gates at 7:31. The drive curved left toward the front entrance, and the headlights, in the way that headlights do, indifferently, without drama, swept across the side courtyard as they turned. Malachi was crouched beside her car, not the house car, not the fleet vehicle reserved for staff, her car. The dark grey coupe she drove on the rare evenings she went out alone, the one with the heated seat she'd had adjusted 3 times before it was right, the one with the small enamel thistle hanging from the rearview mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. He was crouched beside the rear panel, and his hands were doing something deliberate and unhurried, the hands of a man who believed he was alone. He did not look up. Sienna did not breathe. She put her hand on the driver's arm without speaking, and he understood. This too was a quality she paid for, the ability to be understood without words, and the car continued its arc toward the front, as the headlights sweeping away, the side courtyard returning to shadow. She attended the dinner. She smiled. She bid on a first edition collection with her borrowed paddle and won it, and thanked the auctioneer by name and shook hands and accepted champagne she did not drink, and stood in a ballroom full of people who admired her and felt, beneath the silk and the pearls, something very cold settling into the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. At 9:52 p.m., the parking structure beneath the Meridian Hotel shook. She felt it through the soles of her shoes before she heard it. A deep, concussive shudder. The building's bones registering the violence before the sound arrived. Then the sound. Then the screaming from below. Then the smell, faint but unmistakable, of something burning. Her car. As she knew before anyone told her. She knew the way she always knew things. Not by instinct, which was too romantic a word for it, but by logic assembled so quickly it felt like instinct. Her car, the one Malachi had crouched beside in the side courtyard at 7:31 p.m., was now burning in the parking structure 4 floors below the ballroom, where she stood holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. The stone in her chest dropped further. She did not scream. She did not cry. She set her glass down on the nearest table with the precision of a woman setting down something she would never pick up again, and she thought, clearly, coldly, with the full force of everything the Hargrove name had built into her over 31 years, about what happened next. She could run. Her family had houses, accounts, lawyers who answered at any hour. She could be out of the country by morning, safe, free, finished. But finished meant nothing proven. Finished meant Malachi walking away clean, grieving widower, tragic accident, the commission offering condolences, his name intact and his hands unbloodied in the public record. Finished meant he won. Sienna had never finished anything without winning it first. She needed time. She needed access. She needed to be inside that house, inside his orbit, present and invisible simultaneously, and there was only one version of herself that Malachi Vance would never consider a threat. The ambulance arrived at 10:07. She was sitting on the ballroom floor by then, positioned carefully, her dress arranged, her expression constructed into something between shock and vacancy. When the paramedics reached her, she did not respond to visual stimuli, and she did not track the penlight they moved across her field of vision. She stared at the middle distance and let them believe what she needed them to believe. The Hargrove family physician met her at the hospital before Malachi arrived. Dr. Renata Osei, 61 years old, 20 years of Hargrove family service, a woman who understood that loyalty to this family occasionally required a particular quality of silence. Sienna had 4 minutes with her before her husband walked through the door. 4 minutes was enough. Malachi arrived with wet eyes and tight hands and a performance of devastation so accomplished that Sienna, lying motionless in the hospital bed, wondered briefly if she had been wrong, if the man in the courtyard had been someone else. If she had manufactured the whole thing from the paranoia of a woman who had been watching for cracks so long she'd begun to see them in solid walls. Then he spoke to Dr. Osei in the hallway, believing Sienna unconscious, and she heard the particular cadence of a man asking not will she survive, but what are the permanent implications? The emphasis was subtle. Another woman might have missed it. Sienna did not miss things. She came home on a Tuesday, 4 days later, in a wheelchair she had selected herself, high-end, motorized, the kind that communicated money even in tragedy. Dark silk again, because she would not perform helplessness in cheap fabric. Black sunglasses, the white cane resting across her lap, more as emblem than instrument. As Malachi walked beside her through the foyer with his hand on her shoulder and his face arranged into the careful architecture of a devoted husband, and the chandelier blazed above them both, and the marble was cold and white and familiar beneath the wheels of her chair. And Sienna thought, I know every inch of this house. And now, so does my camera system. She had made one phone call from the hospital, a woman named Dara, who had worked for the Hargrove family in a capacity that did not appear on any official payroll, who owed Sienna a debt established 3 years prior, when Sienna had quietly ensured that a certain set of photographs never reached a certain editor's desk. Dara had 41 cameras installed throughout the Vance estate within 72 hours of that call, and embedded in fixtures and frames and the hollow bodies of decorative objects that Malachi had never once looked at closely enough to understand what they cost. The night she came home, after Malachi settled her by the window and excused himself for calls, Sienna pressed the button beneath her armrest and listened to the soft electronic chime in her earpiece that meant the system was live. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 days. Her brother called the next morning, then her mother's attorney, which meant her mother was frightened enough to stop pretending she wasn't frightened. The calls came in a pattern she recognized, concern escalating to urgency, urgency to pressure, and she answered each one the same way, her voice low and carefully unsteady, yet the voice of a woman still assembling herself from wreckage. "Come home," her brother said. His name was Theo, and he was 3 years older than her and had never quite forgiven her for being sharper. "Sienna, come home. We have the house in Cap Ferrat. We have lawyers who can have you out of that marriage in 6 weeks. 8 if he fights it. Come home." "I can't travel," she said. "The doctors." "We'll move the doctors. We'll move everything. Sienna." A pause. She could hear him choosing words with the particular care of someone who believed the wrong ones might break her. "He did this to you." She said nothing. "You know he did. We all know. And if you stay in that house, Theo," she kept her voice soft. "What does a divorce lawyer get me? Testimony? Surveillance he can have suppressed by his own judge? At asset division he'll spend a decade contesting through shells and proxies?" He walks away. He rebuilds. He finds the next woman with the right family name and the wrong instincts, and he does it again. She paused. "I won't let him do it again." Silence on the line. "What are you doing?" Theo said. "Resting," she said. I'm very tired. I'll call you tomorrow." Her mother's call was harder. Her mother had the particular ability to say nothing and communicate everything, And the silences in that conversation were long and weighted and full of things Sienna did not have the armor to receive directly. She kept the call short. She apologized for worrying her. She said the words, "I'm safe," with enough steadiness that her mother chose, as she always did when Sienna used that tone, to believe them. She was not safe. Yet she was in a house with a man who had crouched in a courtyard and done something deliberate with his hands. And she had watched him do it. And he did not know that she had watched. And that gap, that precise, crucial gap between what he knew and what she knew, was the only thing standing between her and the version of this story that ended badly. She intended to make it count. That evening, Malachi brought her dinner on a tray and sat across from her and told her about his day and asked nothing about hers. And she ate slowly and thanked him quietly, and when he left she sat in the dark by the window for a long time with her earpiece in, listening to the estate breathe around her. In the east wing, she could hear Malachi on his phone. The voice on the other end she didn't recognize yet. She would. She had 8 months. She had 41 cameras. She had the patience of a woman raised to understand that the greatest fortunes are not seized. They are waited for, positioned for, cultivated with the quiet, implacable confidence of someone who already knows how the story ends. Sienna Vance sat in her wheelchair in the dark and did not move and did not blink and listened to her husband talk to someone he should not have been talking to, in a house he had tried to make her grave, and she thought about the gala she was already planning in her mind, the screens, the footage, the moment the room went silent. She thought about standing up. She could wait. By the 2nd month, the performance was over. Not Sienna's. Hers continued with the same meticulous discipline she had applied to everything in her life worth doing. She woke each morning at the same hour, dressed in the same register of expensive, muted silk, positioned herself in her chair with the same quality of stillness, and moved through the house with the practiced uncertainty of a woman navigating the world without sight. She had studied it carefully in those first weeks. The slight tilt of the head, the way the hands reached before the body committed to movement, the particular patience of someone who had learned to trust sound over instinct. She was good at it. She had always been good at learning the rules of room she needed to survive. Malachi's performance, by contrast, developed a series of small fractures that widened with the efficiency of things that were never structurally sound to begin with. It started with the visits. In the first month, he came to her room each evening, briefly, then more briefly, but then with the particular energy of a man discharging an obligation rather than fulfilling a desire. He would sit at the edge of the chaise by the window, speak for 10 or 12 minutes about nothing that mattered, and leave. By week 6, the visits shortened to 5 minutes. By week 7, to a knock and a question through the door. "You have everything you need." And she would say, "Yes," and he would say, "Good." And his footsteps would recede down the hallway before she finished the word. By month 2, he stopped coming altogether. Instead, he began using the parlour. The parlour was directly off the main foyer, a long, cold room appointed in dark leather and pale stone that Sienna had never particularly liked. It had been Malachi's choice, the one room in the house that reflected his taste rather than hers, and it had always felt to her like a room designed to impress men who needed to be impressed. He had held the occasional meeting there before the accident, but discreetly, briefly, with the self-consciousness of a man aware that his wife had standards regarding how their home was used. Now, with his wife presumed sightless and sedated by grief, the discretion evaporated entirely. The meetings happened in the evenings, twice a week, then 3 times, then with no apparent schedule at all. Men arriving through the east entrance with the relaxed familiarity of people who had been told the house was safe. She heard them through her earpiece from the adjacent sitting room, where she was routinely placed, a consideration so exalting in its transparency she almost admired it. He was keeping her nearby, she understood, Because a blind woman in the next room was better than a blind woman upstairs with a working telephone. He could monitor her absence of reaction. He could feel safe. She sat with her cane across her lap and her hands folded and her face composed into its practiced vacancy, and she listened to every word, and her system recorded every face. The men talked about numbers she recognized, port logistics, brokerage accounts structured through entities her family's lawyers would have called transparent, and about a name she did not recognize at first, spoken with the particular frequency of something central and unacknowledged. Reyes, said the way men say the name of someone they fear or are paid by, which in her experience amounted to the same thing. She filed it carefully and waited for it to mean something. Katerina arrived in month 5, but Sienna had known she was coming before she appeared, had heard her name in the parlor meetings, heard the specific timbre of Malachi's voice when he mentioned her, a softening so slight that a woman paying less attention would have missed it entirely. She had constructed a partial picture, younger probably, and the kind of beautiful that men in Malachi's world rewarded with proximity to power. She had not anticipated how completely the woman would move into the house, how quickly help with your care would become simply living here now, how Malachi would stop manufacturing explanations altogether, as though Sienna's blindness had freed him from the basic courtesy of pretense. Katerina moved through the house like a woman who had already decided it belonged to her. Sienna heard this in the quality of her footsteps, unhurried, proprietary, the walk of someone taking inventory. She heard it in the way she spoke to the household staff, a particular dismissive warmth, friendly enough to avoid being called cruel. She heard it in the way she laughed at things Malachi said in rooms where Sienna was present, the laughter unguarded and deliberate, designed to be heard. Sienna sat in those rooms and performed blindness and catalogued everything. It was on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after Katerina's arrival, that Malachi came to Sienna's sitting room alone for the first time in months. She heard him before she saw him on the monitor, the deliberate quality of his footsteps, a different rhythm than his usual movement through the house. He was carrying something. She could tell by the slight unevenness in his gait, the way men adjust their walk when they're holding an object they consider precious. He settled into the chair across from her, and she heard the sound of a box, velvet by the soft compression of it, being set on the side table between them. "I want you to feel something," he said. His voice had the particular texture she had come to associate with his kindest performances, low, deliberate, almost tender. It was the voice he used when he needed something from her to feel like generosity. "What is it?" she asked, and her own voice was what she had trained it to be, slightly slowed, slightly flattened, the voice of a woman whose world had contracted to sensation and sound. "Something I had restored," he said. "I found it in your mother's things. I thought you'd want to know it was safe." He took her hand and placed the object in her palm. She knew it before her fingers fully closed around it. She knew it the way you know a thing that has existed in your memory longer than you have existed in your own understanding of yourself. The weight of it, the specific scale of the links, slightly uneven in the way of old handmade things. The small oval pendant with the beveled edge and the hairline scratch along the lower right, from the time she was 9 years old and dropped it on the flagstone terrace of the Cap Ferrat house and screamed herself hoarse in terror until her mother laughed and told her a scratch meant it had a life. Her mother's necklace, the one her grandmother had brought from Lisbon, the one that had sat in a locked box in her mother's dressing room for 20 years and then, upon her mother's death 7 years ago, had been left to Sienna specifically, itemized in the will, the only piece of jewellery her mother had named individually. The one Sienna kept in the safe in her own dressing room, behind a panel she had never shown Malachi, because some things she had believed then were not marital property. They were proof of origin. They were the record of where you came from before someone else decided what you were worth. She turned it in her hands and kept her face completely still. "Do you recognize it?" he asked. And there was something in the question, a quality of anticipation, that told her he already knew the answer and was watching her for it. "Yes," she said softly. "Here, it's Mother's." "I thought it should be worn," he said. "It's too beautiful to sit in a box." A pause. "I'm going to give it to someone who can appreciate it properly, not to her." He would not offer it back to the woman who could not see it, who could not appreciate it, who had been reduced in his accounting to someone for whom beautiful things were no longer relevant. He was telling her what he was doing. He was telling her because he believed she had no framework left to hold grief with, that blindness and loss had emptied her of the particular kind of pain that required a witness. He was explaining a theft to the person he was stealing from because he believed she could not understand what was being taken. Sienna set the necklace back in his hand with the careful, fumbling gentleness of a woman who could not see what she was returning. "Of course," she said. "Someone should wear it." He left 20 minutes later. His footsteps moved down the hall toward the east wing, toward the room that had been a guest suite until it wasn't anymore, and Sienna sat in the dim sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and her face still and her eyes absolutely dry. She did not grieve it that night. She put the grief somewhere sealed and load-bearing, and she went to work. The name Reyes had been accumulating context for 3 months by then. She had cross-referenced the names from the parlor meetings against the Vance organization's known operational structure, information she had always had access to, had always quietly absorbed. But in the way that intelligent women in proximity to powerful men absorb operational detail as a matter of survival, and the pattern that emerged was not subtle once she knew to look for it. The Reyes cartel operated out of the Southeastern Corridor, a rival structure that the Commission had been actively working to contain for 2 years. They had resources but limited institutional access. They lacked the port relationships and financial infrastructure that the Vance organization had spent a generation building. They had been looking, by all available intelligence, for a way in. Malachi was the way in. It clarified across 3 weeks of parlor recordings the specific intelligence he was passing, and the operational schedules and commission meeting locations and the names of people who trusted him, being exchanged for a number she eventually calculated at approximately $40 million, structured across accounts she traced through shell entities to a private bank in Liechtenstein. The kind of account established in anticipation of a life somewhere warmer and less complicated, a life with a younger woman in a red dress and a necklace that had belonged to someone else's mother. He was not simply having an affair. He was liquidating everything: his organization, his allegiances, the safety of every man and family who had operated under the Vance name in good faith. And he was doing it methodically and without apparent remorse. Just because Malachi Vance had always understood power as a resource to be extracted rather than a responsibility to be held. Sienna sat with this knowledge for one night. She allowed herself exactly that. One night of sitting with the full weight of what she had uncovered, the sheer scale of the betrayal, the almost elegant comprehensiveness of a man willing to destroy every single thing around him in service of his own continuation. She had come into this house to save herself, to gather enough evidence to end a marriage and prosecute an attempted murder and walk out of the Vance estate with her name clean and her assets intact. That was still true, but what she had in her recording system now was not a divorce case. It was a detonation. The Commission would want it. The FBI would want it. As the rival families whose operational security had been sold to Reyes for $40 million would want it with an urgency that bypassed legal process entirely. And that was a variable she would need to manage carefully, because she needed Malachi arrested, not disappeared. She needed him to stand in a room and hear what she had to say while there were people present to witness it. She needed a room. She needed an audience. She needed an occasion so public and so central to his sense of himself that he would not see it coming from the woman he had left in the corner. She pulled up the estate's event calendar on the tablet concealed in her wheelchair's side compartment. Malachi's 35th birthday was 9 weeks away. He had already instructed the household coordinator to begin planning a gala. Oh, Sienna read through the preliminary notes. 500 guests, the Vance ballroom, catering from the firm they always used. The AV system contracted for a presentation Malachi apparently intended to give regarding a new business venture. And she felt something shift in her chest. Not grief, not even anger precisely, something cleaner than both. She began to make her own arrangements. The ballroom of the Vance estate had never looked more beautiful, and Sienna had made sure of it. She had overseen every detail from her wheelchair with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that the staging of a room is the staging of a story, and she intended this particular story to be unforgettable. 200 white orchids flown in from a grower in Thailand. His crystal stemware that caught the chandelier light and scattered it like broken promises across the ceiling. A string quartet in the east corner, playing something low and European and expensive. The guest list was Malachi's, 500 people, the full architecture of his world, commission representatives and their wives, the new business partners he'd been cultivating for months, with a smile that Sienna had watched on 41 cameras and understood for exactly what it was. He had planned this evening as a coronation. She had planned it as a demolition. Malachi had positioned her himself, which she found almost poetic. He had wheeled her to an alcove near the base of the grand staircase, close enough to the room's centre to serve as a visible symbol of his tragedy, far enough from the podium to be forgotten once the speeches began. Yet he had crouched to her level and straightened her wrap around her shoulders and told her she looked beautiful, and his eyes had held the particular warmth of a man who has already moved on and is merely observing the formality of pretending otherwise. "Are you comfortable?" he asked. "Perfectly," Sienna said. He patted her hand and walked away. She sat with her cane across her lap and her dark glasses in place and watched 500 people fill the room around her, and through none of them, not one. Not the commission wives in their jewels or the underbosses in their tailored suits, or Katerina, who arrived in a green dress this time and took her place at Malachi's side with the proprietary ease of a woman who had stopped being careful. Through none of them looked at her directly. How she had become what Malachi needed her to be, set dressing. A portrait of misfortune that made his success look more luminous by contrast. She had spent 8 months becoming invisible. She had 1 hour left to use it. In her earpiece, Dara's voice was calm and technical, a woman running a production. "A V-booth is ours. Feed is loaded and queued. FBI unit is staged in 3 vehicles on the North Service Road. They move on your signal. Commission liaison confirmed present, table 7, the man in the grey pocket square." A pause. "Sienna, everything is in position." Sienna's thumb moved once against the armrest. "Lawyers confirmed asset freeze triggers the moment the federal warrant activates. Everything in the Vance corporate structure, the holdings, goldhongs, the accounts. The property portfolio transfers to the Hargrove Trust within 72 hours of arrest." Another pause, softer this time. 8 months of work. You ready?" Sienna's expression did not change. Behind the dark glasses, her eyes moved slowly across the room. Across the orchids, the crystal, the chandelier that had watched her come home broken and had watched her sit in the dark night after night while her husband rewrote the rules of their life without her permission. And her eyes settled finally on Malachi at the podium, adjusting his cuffs, accepting a microphone from a staff member with the reflexive ease of a man entirely at home in the world he believed was his. She pressed her thumb against the armrest once more. "Ready," she said. The room settled as Malachi raised his glass. The string quartet resolved their phrase and fell silent. 500 people oriented themselves toward the man at the podium, and he stood there for a moment, in the particular way he had, shoulders back, a half-smile arranged with practiced ease, the posture of someone who had rehearsed charisma until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. "5 years ago," he began, his voice low and carrying, "I stood in a room considerably less beautiful than this one, and made a decision that changed everything." The screens behind him bloomed to life. Malachi did not notice immediately. He was looking at his guests, working the room with his eyes the way he always did, making each person feel briefly singular. The screens were behind him, and the first few seconds of footage were silent. And the room's reaction was not immediate. It was a slow thing, a ripple rather than a wave, beginning at the back where the screens were most visible and moving forward as people turned and looked and went still. The footage was high definition and time-stamped and unambiguous. The side courtyard of the Vance estate. 7:31 p.m. A man crouched beside a dark grey coupe, his hands moving with deliberate efficiency beneath the rear panel. The tattoos were visible even in the low light. The particular ink that mapped Malachi Vance's arms and neck and told the stories he never explained out loud. He turned from his guests to see what they were looking at. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of comprehension. 500 people understanding simultaneously what they were watching and what it meant, and recalibrating everything they thought they knew. The footage kept moving, unhurried, thorough. Malachi in the study. Across a table from two men Sienna had spent 6 weeks identifying through commission records and law enforcement databases. Men who worked for the Salazar cartel. Malachi's organization's primary rival and most mortal enemy. Documents crossing the table, names, locations. The particular intelligence that only a man at the center of the Vance syndicate could possess, being handed to people who would use it to dismantle everything that intelligence described. Malachi at the podium had stopped speaking. His glass was still raised. His face had moved through several expressions quickly and arrived at something pale and fixed. Then the last sequence. Katerina's arrival on month 3, the hallway kiss. Yes, the escalating domestic intimacy of a woman making herself at home in a marriage that had been declared privately already over. And beneath it, the audio. Malachi's voice, recorded with the crystalline fidelity of a system that had cost Dara a significant portion of the debt she owed. Telling Katerina that the wife was not a concern, that the wife was handled, that the wife would not be a problem for much longer. A woman at table 4 put down her champagne. The commission liaison at table 7 had gone very still. Malachi lowered his glass. The room was absolutely silent when Sienna's wheelchair began to move. She did not hurry. She had not hurried in 8 months, and she did not hurry now. The motorized chair carried her forward from the alcove at the pace she chose. And 500 people turned from the screens to the woman in dark silk and black glasses, moving through the center of the room, and the parting they made for her was not the polite parting of guests deferring to a woman in a wheelchair. It was something else, something older. The instinctive clearing of space for something that has revealed itself to be dangerous. She stopped the chair 10 feet from the podium. The room waited. Sienna reached up and removed her glasses. She held them loosely in one hand and looked at her husband with her own eyes, clear and dark and entirely steady, and the expression on her face was not anger. Anger was too imprecise a thing for what she had built across 8 months of silence and stillness and careful, unrelenting patience. It was something closer to resolution. But the expression of a woman who has completed a thing she set out to complete. Then she stood up. It was not dramatic in the way that stage gestures are dramatic. It was simply movement. Her hands on the armrests, her body rising, the white cane she had carried as prop for 8 months, now left resting in the seat behind her. She stood in the center of the room she had decorated for this exact moment, in the ballroom of the house that had been her prison and her laboratory. And she was in heels. She had been in heels for every day of the 8 months, beneath the dress, on the footrest of the wheelchair, waiting. And she walked. Malachi's face broke. It did not break the way faces break in grief. It broke the way structures break when a foundational element is removed, rapidly, comprehensively, with a kind of catastrophic totality. His mouth moved before sound came out. She stopped in front of him. "Sienna!" I saw everything, Malachi. Her voice was conversational, clear. It carried the way voices carry in silent rooms. Every meeting, every phone call, every document you signed across our dining room table. She tilted her head slightly, especially the part where you thought I was weak. He reached for her arm. The commission liaison at table 7 stood up. What followed was not slow. The liaisons moved first. The practiced, unhurried efficiency of men who have managed threats professionally for decades, 2 of them crossing to Malachi's position before his hand had fully closed around Sienna's arm, interposing themselves with the polite implacability of people for whom violence is simply overhead. But the other underbosses at their tables were very still in the way that armed men are still when they are deciding whether the situation requires them to become visible. The north doors opened. The FBI moved well. Sienna had been told they would, and they did. 12 agents in the dark jackets and the flat, deliberate authority of a federal warrant spreading through the room in the pattern that had been coordinated through channels Sienna had spent month 5 establishing after she'd realized the scope of what Malachi was selling. RICO, attempted murder, conspiracy. The charges had been building for 3 months in a federal case file that Malachi had no idea existed. Assembled from evidence that had been sitting in the servers of a surveillance system he had never thought to look for in the home of a woman he believed could not see. And Malachi looked at the agents, at the commission men, at the screens, which were still running, at Katerina, who had moved to the far edge of the room with the particular swiftness of a woman recalculating her position. Then he looked at Sienna. You? He stopped, started again. How long? 8 months, she said. Something moved across his face, not the performance of emotion this time, but the thing beneath the performance, the raw, unmediated response of a man encountering something he cannot explain within the architecture of how he believes the world works. He looked at her the way people look at things that have exceeded the category they assigned them. You're a... Careful, Sienna said pleasantly. The agents reached him before he finished the sentence. He did not go quietly. She had not expected him to. Malachi Vance had never done anything quietly in his life, and the indignity of handcuffs in front of 500 people and the men who ran his world appeared to dissolve whatever remained of his composure entirely. He said her name several times, each time with a different weight. He told the agents that she had manipulated the footage. He told the commission men that the documents were fabricated. He said the word witch at a volume that carried across the ballroom and bounced off the marble and the crystal and the 200 white orchids and dissolved into the high ceiling above the chandelier. A staff member appeared at Sienna's elbow with a fresh glass of champagne. She accepted it. She watched her husband be removed from his own ballroom through the north doors, still talking, his voice diminishing with distance, and she stood in the center of the room he had placed her in as furniture, and she was standing, and she was unhurried, and she was drinking champagne that tasted, she decided, exactly the way she had imagined it would across 8 months of sitting still and waiting. The commission liaison appeared beside her. Mrs. Vance. He was a careful man, older, the grey pocket square precise. A word, when you're ready. Of course, Sienna said. The organization will need. I know what it needs, she said. I'll be in touch. He considered her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man revising a prior assessment, then inclined his head with the slight formal deference of someone acknowledging that the most powerful person in the room has just clarified who they are. He returned to his table. While Sienna stood in the center of the ballroom for another moment, her champagne in one hand and Malachi's absence in front of her, and 8 months of accumulated weight beginning finally to lift. Not all at once, but incrementally, the way a room lightens as dawn comes, a gradual returning of something she had set down a long time ago and was only now remembering she was allowed to carry. Then she turned and walked back through the room that had made way for her and retrieved her glasses from the seat of the wheelchair she was finished with and put them on. Not because the world was too bright yet, but because she had decided the future was worth dressing for. Her phone buzzed once. Her lawyer's message was 4 words. Assets confirmed. All yours. Sienna Vance walked out of her own ballroom and did not look back. What if this story moved you even a little? Take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Tell me your city or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel around the world. Until the next story, take care of yourselves.